My name is Bill Whitfield. I'm one of Michael Jackson's former personal security.
Yes, indeed. It's so much I want to talk to you about, man. There's so much to get into. I don't know where to start, but I do want to ask you. I had no idea that movie, Searching for Neverland, that was based off of your book.
What if the world's biggest pop icon saw the warning signs before anyone else did? Months before his death, Jackson reportedly made a chilling prediction to his bodyguard. "Now you're gonna see the vultures coming." At the time, it sounded like a passing comment. Looking back, it feels haunting. Was his final chapter really about one doctor, or a story shaped by pressure, financial battles, and a comeback that changed everything? In this video, we'll uncover first-hand accounts from those closest to Jackson and separate courtroom facts from personal memory. The bodyguard who saw it unfold. Before the world learned the name Conrad Murray, before any courtroom sorted through what had gone wrong, there was a much quieter warning, delivered in private, months ahead of the tragedy. Bill Whitfield had spent years as part of Michael Jackson's security detail.
Of Michael Jackson, the three bodyguards he trusted with his life, speaking out for the first time.
Present for the ordinary rhythm of a life most people only saw in headlines. When the This Is It concert series was finally confirmed, set to bring Jackson back to a stage after years away, Whitfield remembered a specific conversation, one that did not seem especially significant at the time. Jackson turned to him and said simply, "Now you're gonna see the vultures coming." It would take months for those words to make complete sense. What changed was not subtle. Once the tour became official, people who had been absent from Jackson's life for years suddenly resurfaced, each with a reason to be involved, each wanting a piece of what was being billed as the biggest comeback of his career. What draws people back into someone's life the exact moment that person becomes valuable again? Why would a project meant to celebrate Jackson's return also become the thing that overwhelmed him before it ever began? Whitfield described watching the shift firsthand. Phone calls arriving from people trying to reach Jackson directly. Old associates suddenly reappearing with proposals and requests. He had not fully understood what Jackson meant by that warning until he was fielding the calls himself, watching strangers and half-forgotten acquaintances angle for a place inside a production that had not even started rehearsals yet. That crush of attention did not stay confined to business matters. Whitfield's account paints a picture of a man being pulled in every direction at once. Artistic decisions competing with financial pressure. Old relationships competing with new ones. Everyone insisting they had Jackson's best interests in mind, while jockeying for position around him. Is it possible to prepare for a comeback of that scale, while simultaneously managing the very people the comeback attracted? Whitfield's answer, in hindsight, seemed to be no. The tour that was supposed to restore Jackson's career instead became the mechanism that filled his final months with exactly the kind of chaos his warning had predicted. What made the situation harder to manage was that almost none of these competing voices could simply be turned away. Many had genuine history with Jackson, old collaborators and associates whose claims to involvement were not baseless, which meant navigating the return of the tour required diplomacy as much as security, a skill set bodyguards are rarely trained for, but were nonetheless expected to provide. Whitfield has been careful not to reduce Jackson's final period to a single explanation. He has pointed instead to stress as a recurring, compounding factor, the accumulated weight of a life where too many people wanted a piece of the same person at once. There were, in his telling, several forces working on Jackson simultaneously, not one clean cause that could be isolated and blamed. That complexity is part of what makes his account different from the tidy version that emerged from the courtroom. A trial has to identify a legally responsible party. A bodyguard who lived inside the chaos does not have that obligation. and his memory reflects a messier, more human version of the same story. There is a particular irony in how the This Is It rehearsals unfolded against this backdrop. Jackson was, by most accounts, deeply committed to the creative side of the production, pouring energy into staging and choreography even as the business side of his life grew more chaotic around him. Could a man genuinely immersed in perfecting a stage show also be unraveling under pressure most of his own team never fully saw? Whitfield's account suggests both things were happening at once. A professional determination to deliver something extraordinary, running alongside a private exhaustion that rarely surfaced in front of cameras or crew. The secret life Michael Jackson fought to protect. Security work around Michael Jackson was never only about Jackson himself. Whitfield's responsibilities extended to the people around him, particularly his children. And the picture he has described is one of a father determined to give them something resembling an ordinary childhood, despite circumstances that were anything but ordinary. Jackson was, by Whitfield's account, adamant that his kids live a normal life, insulated as much as possible from the pressure surrounding their father. Can a childhood built on that much concealment ever really qualify as normal, even if it looks that way from the outside? What does normal even mean for children whose father cannot walk through a hotel lobby without a security team clearing the path first? The answer, in practice, involved a level of secrecy most families never have to consider. Whitfield has described shielding the children from what he called the madness and craziness surrounding their household, keeping them unaware of just how precarious their situation sometimes became. Death threats and threatening letters arrived at front desks during hotel stays, and the response was not negotiation or investigation in the moment, it was departure. Whitfield would make the call to leave in the middle of the night, moving the family without explanation. The children left unaware of why they were suddenly relocating again. It was protection built on concealment, a defense mechanism that worked precisely because the people it was protecting never had to understand the danger it was protecting them from. That arrangement demanded a particular kind of vigilance, one that rarely appears in public accounts of Jackson's life, because it was designed specifically not to be visible. A bodyguard's success, in this context, is measured by the absence of incident.
Part 2 of our exclusive interview with Michael Jackson's bodyguards, speaking out for the first time about being inside Jackson's world during the last days of his life.
By threats that never materialized into anything the family had to confront directly. How many close calls did a family like this experience without ever knowing how close they actually came? Whitfield's account suggests the number was not small, and that the ordinary appearance of the children's daily life was itself evidence of how much effort was being spent to maintain it. The emotional labor involved in this kind of protection rarely gets acknowledged either. Maintaining a calm, reassuring presence for children who could sense tension even when they were not told its source required a discipline that extended well beyond the physical demands of the job. A constant performance of normalcy layered over decisions being made in real time about genuine danger. This dimension of Whitfield's story rarely makes it into typical retrospectives of Jackson's final year, which tend to focus almost entirely on medical details and legal proceedings. But the security apparatus surrounding the family reveals something important about the environment Jackson was operating in during that period. One where external threats and internal pressure from the tour's return were compounding at the same time. A man managing a comeback of unprecedented scale was, simultaneously, managing credible threats against his own children. Neither pressure canceled the other out. They accumulated, layered on top of an already demanding schedule, in the months leading up to a death that would eventually be attributed to a single medical decision made on a single night. There was also a financial and logistical dimension to this protection that rarely gets discussed. Moving a family in the middle of the night, without warning, without explanation to the children themselves, required resources most households never have to think about. Hotel changes arranged quietly, transportation coordinated on short notice, a rotating sense of where was actually safe. What kind of toll does it take to maintain that level of vigilance for years without a single visible incident to justify it to outsiders? Whitfield's account suggests the toll was constant, even when nothing appeared to be happening, because the entire point of the system was to make sure nothing ever did. Success in that line of work leaves no headline behind, only the quiet accumulation of nights that passed without incident. Nights nobody outside the security detail ever had reason to think about twice. The business genius behind Michael Jackson. To understand the pressure surrounding Michael Jackson in his final years, it helps to understand what he was actually managing beyond music itself. Because Jackson was not simply a performer preparing for a tour. He was the owner of one of the most valuable music catalogs in history, a position that came from a decision most people in the industry considered reckless at the time. What kind of artist looks past his own next album and decides to buy someone else's entire back catalog instead? In 1985, Jackson purchased ATV Music Publishing, outbidding his friend Paul McCartney in the process, for a reported $47,500,000. The catalog included the publishing rights to the majority of the Beatles' songs, an asset McCartney himself had once hoped to reclaim. Why would an artist already carrying the weight of his own career take on an asset that complicated and that expensive? The answer, in hindsight, looked like foresight. Paul McCartney himself had reportedly hoped to acquire the very same publishing rights, having encouraged Jackson years earlier to understand the value of owning music catalogs rather than simply performing songs written by others. When Jackson outbid him instead, the friendship between the two men cooled noticeably, a personal cost that accompanied what would eventually prove to be an extraordinarily lucrative business decision. A decade later, in 1995, Jackson merged his stake in ATV with Sony's own publishing arm.
Unlocking some iconic songs. Sony will buy Michael Jackson's stake in the world's largest music publisher for $750 million.
Forming Sony/ATV Music Publishing, selling half of the combined company to Sony for $95 million. The new entity became one of the largest music publishing operations in the world, holding rights that stretched far beyond the Beatles into decades of popular music history. Jackson retained ownership of half of it, an asset that would only grow more valuable as the years passed. That value came with a cost most fans never saw. At the time of his death, Jackson's estate carried roughly $500 million in debt, the accumulated result of years of extravagant spending set against an income that, however enormous, still could not keep pace. How does a person who owns hundreds of millions of dollars in assets still end up drowning financially year after year? Managing an asset this valuable while personally drowning in debt created its own particular strain, one separate from the pressures of touring or fatherhood, but no less real. What does it feel like to own something worth hundreds of millions of dollars while simultaneously being unable to cover your own bills? For Jackson, that contradiction was not hypothetical. It was daily life. The full scale of that foresight would not become clear until years after his death. In 2016, 7 years after Jackson died, Sony purchased the estate's remaining 50% stake in Sony/ATV for $750 million, taking complete ownership of the catalog. A purchase once considered an eccentric gamble had, by then, become recognized as one of the shrewdest financial decisions in music industry history. Jackson never lived to see that vindication. The business empire he built quietly in the background of his performing career outlived him by decades, still generating headlines and valuations long after the man who assembled it was gone. A strange kind of legacy, running in parallel with the more painful one attached to his final months. The estate's stewardship of that catalog after his death only reinforced how valuable Jackson's original instinct had been. In 2012, a group led by Sony/ATV and the Jackson estate closed a deal worth roughly $2.2 billion to acquire EMI Music Publishing, a catalog containing well over 1 million songs. How does an estate carrying $500 million in debt at the time of a man's death end up participating in a multi-billion-dollar acquisition only a few years later? The answer lies almost entirely in the value of the publishing rights Jackson had insisted on owning outright decades earlier. Rights that continued generating income regardless of what else was happening in his personal life. It is a strange kind of consolation that the financial instinct so often overshadowed by the more painful parts of his story ended up providing for his children long after he was no longer there to manage it himself. Michael Jackson's final warning signs. Matt Fiddes knew Michael Jackson from a different angle than Whitfield, as both a business associate and a former member of his security circle, close enough to witness some of Jackson's most private frustrations. One of those frustrations centered on the 2001 album Invincible, a project Jackson had poured years into and expected to match the success of Thriller. Exactly how many copies Invincible sold has never been fully agreed upon. Estimates range widely depending on the source, but by any measure, it fell well short of the numbers Thriller had put up nearly 2 decades earlier. When it fell short of that impossible bar commercially, Fiddes described watching Jackson erupt in anger on the phone with his own team, convinced the album had not received the promotional support it deserved, at one point locking himself in a bathroom, sobbing that years of his life had been wasted. That disappointment mattered because of what Fiddes says came next. According to his account, Jackson borrowed heavily from Sony to fund the ambitions behind that album, and to secure the loan, he put up his most valuable asset as collateral, his stake in the music catalog he had spent years building. Why would an artist risk the very asset that had made him one of the wealthiest men in music history to fund one more album? Fiddes has suggested Jackson wanted nothing less than to surpass his own legacy. One more attempt to outdo Thriller on its own terms, regardless of the financial exposure that came with it. That kind of wager only makes sense in the context of an artist who had spent his entire adult life defined by commercial records most performers never approach even once, let alone repeatedly, a standard that had become, by his own account, both a source of pride and an exhausting measuring stick he continued applying to himself. The medical dimension of Fiddes' account is harder to sit with. He has described Jackson relying on a physician who traveled with him and provided medication to help him sleep. A doctor Fiddes says was present in ways that went beyond ordinary care. At what point does round-the-clock medical access stop looking like care and start looking like dependency? Fiddes has spoken about a phone conversation with Jackson on a Tuesday night, days before his death, in which Jackson sounded completely erratic.
CPR, then that's the cause of death.
Unlike anything Fiddes had witnessed even during earlier difficult periods. When Fiddes asked directly whether Jackson had taken something, Jackson's response was brief. "Don't worry, the doctor gave me something." What stayed with Fiddes afterward was not only the medication itself, but the strangeness of the rest of that call. Jackson asked whether Fiddes knew how to reach his father, Joseph, a request that struck Fiddes as unusual, given the well-documented distance between Jackson and Joseph over the years. Jackson also asked for another contact, seemingly running low on numbers he could easily reach that night. He spoke briefly with Fidus's children before the call ended. An ordinary, almost domestic moment folded into a conversation that, in retrospect, carried an unmistakable weight. How do you separate an unremarkable late-night phone call from a warning sign when the only thing that makes it a warning sign is what happened days later? Fidus was not the only person in Jackson's circle who later found meaning in a detail that seemed unremarkable at the time. Motown legend Smokey Robinson, a longtime friend, has spoken about his own experience under anesthesia during a medical procedure years after Jackson's death, and how being told what medication he was receiving brought Jackson's final months rushing back to him. For someone who had known Jackson personally, hearing that the same drug used routinely in minor procedures was the one that had ended his friend's life was less a revelation than a quiet, lingering discomfort, the kind that surfaces unexpectedly in an entirely unrelated setting. The verdict that couldn't end the story. The legal resolution to Michael Jackson's death.
Update you now on tonight's breaking news. Multiple media outlets are now reporting that pop singer Michael Jackson has died.
Arrived with more clarity than the human story surrounding it ever did. Conrad Murray, the personal physician who had been giving Jackson propofol as a sleep aid, was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in November of 2011. Can a single conviction ever really settle a story this layered, even when the verdict itself is not in question? He was sentenced to 4 years, though a change in California law tied to jail overcrowding meant he ultimately served just under 2, walking free in October of 2013. His medical licenses were suspended or revoked in multiple states in the aftermath, effectively ending the career that had once made him Jackson's trusted physician. For Tito Jackson, Michael's brother, the legal outcome never fully addressed the personal loss underneath it. Asked about learning of his brother's death, Tito described it plainly. "It was the worst feeling I've ever experienced in my life." He has spoken about losing other relatives over the years, but none of those losses compared to losing a sibling he had grown up alongside, someone whose passing left what he described as his whole inner self feeling as though it had melted. What separates grief over a public figure's death from grief over a brother's death, when millions of strangers are mourning the same person you grew up sharing a bedroom with? When asked directly about Murray's role, Tito's response avoided the easy path of outright condemnation. He has spoken about being raised, particularly by his mother, to forgive, while still drawing a clear line between forgiveness and excusing responsibility. In his telling, Murray's failure was not necessarily malicious, but it was still a failure, a doctor who should have been monitoring his patient rather than occupied elsewhere that night. That distinction between forgiving a person and still holding them accountable for what they failed to do runs through much of how those closest to Jackson have processed his death in the years since. That balance between compassion and accountability is not an easy position to maintain in public, particularly for a family that has spent years watching strangers debate the circumstances of a brother's death from a distance. Is it possible to genuinely forgive someone for a fatal lapse in judgment, while still believing, without hesitation, that the lapse itself was real and preventable? Tito's account suggests it is, though it clearly requires holding two difficult ideas at once: a private grief that has nothing to do with the legal record, and an acceptance of that record that does not erase the grief underneath it. That tension between what a courtroom can settle and what a family continues carrying long after the courtroom has moved on may be the closest thing to a through line across every account gathered here. What the bodyguards and family members closest to Jackson describe:
there was never anyone around him. There's another bodyguard called Bill Whitfield who looked after him for the last 2 years of his life.
Is not a mystery requiring a new explanation. The court reached its verdict, and nothing in these accounts contradicts it. What their memories add is texture the courtroom never had room for, the accumulated stress of a comeback tour that summoned people from every direction, the quiet work of shielding children from threats they never knew existed, the financial gamble that eventually paid off decades after Jackson's death, and a final phone call that only became significant in hindsight. None of it changes who was legally responsible. All of it explains why the people who lived through it have never been able to describe his death as simply, or as finally, as the courtroom did. A verdict can close a case. It cannot, by itself, account for every pressure that led to the night the case was built around. And that gap is exactly where these first-hand accounts continue to live. A courtroom gave the world a verdict. It never gave the world the full picture. Behind that conviction sat months of pressure most people never saw. Old faces circling a comeback, threats a family was never told about, a fortune used as collateral, and a warning about vultures that turned out exactly right. None of that changes who was legally responsible. It just explains why the people who lived through it have never summed up his death in one sentence. Which part of this story surprised you most? Let us know in the comments. Hit like if this deserved more attention, and subscribe for more first-hand accounts history glosses over.